Okay, by 11. Here we go. 16.2 is the topic, evolution as genetic change. This is a whopper of a topic. I'm going to see if I can keep myself to under 50 minutes on this one. When we look at evolution as genetic change, we look at things like natural selection, and we ask ourselves the question, what is really being selected? Is it the phenotype? Is it the genotype? Well, the answer is, we've seen this in the previous lectures, it is your physical expression that helps you survive, but indirectly your genetics. How does natural selection affect you if you just consider it as being at the genetic level? Okay, that's what this is all about. A great number of topics come up here. You want to pay attention. Selection is all about who survives and lives to reproduce and who doesn't. Okay, are you fit? Did you have the adaptations overall to survive and reproduce, or didn't you? Okay, that's the essence of selection. Artificial selection, well, we've already seen it's a little bit interesting because there's interference, right? Humans can interfere in the breeding process, choosing the individuals who survive and reproduce, those that don't. But when it comes right down to it, the change of a population, and if that population keeps changing, it's a change over time in the alleles. What are the gene types in that population? So you have to consider evolution at the population level, not just at the individual level, because there can be flukes at the individual level, and you don't want to look at the exceptions instead of the trends. Single gene traits, they're kind of convenient for illustrative purposes. If we looked at the evolution of eye color, it's not a great one, but single gene traits, well, looking at their allelic frequencies, that can be a little simpler, a slightly simpler way of looking at evolution. Really all we're referring to here. I love this slide. It's a great slide because let's look at some mutant lizards. Okay, always makes me think of the Spider-Man movies. And let's say we have an initial population of our brown lizards, and they account for about 80% of the population. Now, due to chance circumstance, little DNA rearrangements, we get some different DNA, and it's expressing protein, and some of that protein is producing some critters out there, and they're coming out a blackish color. And then we get this crazy sort of red. Well, I'll tell you about this crazy sort of red. It stands out. My way of describing this is to say, well, imagine an environment where they can blend in amongst the trees or in amongst the sort of the dark colored foliage, the rocks, and out pops a bright red version. Survivability, unless there's something about that bright red lizard, unless it had developed sort of a toxic aftertaste, it's going to get picked off. It's like the bright pink bunny rabbit, well, the bright pink snowshoe hare hanging out, in the middle of a winter field, with a sign that says "Eat me," because that's about what this is going to do. It'll be selected right out, and its genes, it's probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to survive. As we look at the generations, and as they move along, by the 10th generation, we see, well, check that out. Probably wasn't such a good idea to have that phenotype. Those genes, they're off the menu, and they continue to stay off the menu. Alternatively, though, we see that there's an increase, let's say, in the darker colored body type. Turns out that was an advantage. They're getting picked off less, and as they get picked off less, they tend to survive, and as they tend to survive, they tend to mate. They start to get a little bit of a phenotypic advantage. Keep an eye on the generations above, because this version starts to pick up steam, eventually accounting for 6/10 of the population, while the original parent generation, well, they're just not quite as successful, and it's all sort of a breeding out process. Population begins to shift a little bit. That is the essence of mutation and evaluation inside of a populace. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Well, it depends on if the phenotype influences survival, and if it influences survival, is it good moving forward for that population? How does it affect the fitness, right? That's the big question. How does natural selection go after multiple gene traits? Well, that can be a little more challenging. It's almost like saying, well, how can natural selection go after height? Is that good? Well, depends on how it interacts with the environment. Really, when it comes right down to it, whether it's a single gene or whether it's polygenic, what kind of selection is happening? Let's just look at the result. And there's been some interesting patterns, statistical patterns that have popped out, where we can look at sort of the progression of the selection process. Is selection moving towards something? Is there is diversity being lost? Are we kind of coming in towards an average? Or are two populations popping out of a sort of a common parental generation? And we call that disruptive selection. There's 3 types that you must know for my course. Okay? You should know it. Anyways, whenever I talk about directional selection, you'll hear me talking about the horse. Stabilizing selection, think husky. And disruptive selection, think of populations that began together but moved apart. So my classic sort of stock examples, this one, the husky, and disruptively, I'd like to talk about the 3-spine stickleback. Sure, there's more examples, but let's stick to something we can remember. And hopefully I spelled stickleback right. Sounds good. Oh look, my cat's coming around. I'm gonna have to shoo my cat. She always wants to be part of these lectures. One day I'll just have to put her on camera. I think I can. She's walking on me now, but it's all right. She wants to be a part of the show. Okay, just as long as she doesn't touch the iPad screen. That's how I do these. Sometimes evolution moves in a very predictable orientation. In this case, what's being discovered is that beak size, remember those old Galapagos finches, right? This guy right here. When we look at beak size, what we've determined seems to be the case is that the beak seems to be getting larger. And that's a bit of an advantage overall, because what it lets you do, well, lets the bird do, is it can get at the fruits, it can get at the nuts, which are more commonly available on these islands. Sure, the insects are great, but those fruit and nuts, wow, you really want to be able to take those on. What we've seen is once upon a time, the bird beak was, let's just say, illustratively about this big, and the new norm is a larger beak. Human beings are following this pattern. We used to be somewhat shorter than we are now, on average, around 5'5", and the average, well, Canadian male height anyways, is hitting like 5'7", 5'8". There's a definite direction to the selectional process. The number of critters with large beaks is going up on average. The average, the 50-yard line has moved. It's now over here. That, ladies and gentlemen, is something we call directional selection. Okay? We've seen this with the evolution of the horse. Started out small, boy has it gotten big. Okay, here's a graphic that I put in from another slideshow that I did once upon a yesteryear. Let's switch this up. Let's go with the green. Once upon a time, horses were just this little tiny creature. And how do we know this? We've dug up these skeletons through the fossil record. And there's a definite progression where horses have become much larger creatures. Now it's interesting. There's probably a PhD to be had to discuss, well, why did they get bigger? Certainly understandable once humans got a hold of them. We started to breed them for tilling of the fields, etc. And that explains, right, the modern day Clydesdale and the horses that we've bred. We've very much accelerated the process. But the horse itself, it was an advantage in the body design for body size, the average, to expand to the point today where they're pretty darn big. That is definitely what we call directional selection. But sometimes, instead of moving to an extreme, let's make this a little smaller, sometimes instead of moving to the extreme, you come in from the extremes. And here's a great example. When you look at the size of babies being born, your typical baby's around about 7 pounds. In the Middle Ages, it does vary with the size of the mother. In the Middle Ages, when the mothers could be as young as 12 to 13 years of age, the baby could be the size of a 3-pound infant. But by modern standards, when we look at this, sure, you get those huge babies, right? I've seen cases of discussions where the baby was 10, 11, 12, even 13 pounds. And then there's babies which are down here, your premature babies, very small. So your extreme sized critters, as far as babies go, are a bit more of a rarity. But on average, it's about 7 pounds, what we see in the middle here. And that kind of makes sense because, well, that's an easier baby for humans to bear. So even a human young are an example of stabilizing selection. Okay? Stabilizing is largely where the curves, or the ends of the curves, the extremes, are reduced and the middle is favored. Stabilizing selection is very well exemplified in huskies. Huskies, if you look at huskies, there's not really huge ones and they're not really small ones. They're just kind of, well, they're all kind of the same size. Pretty dog. Well, over time, the husky body type is really being perfected to this sort of small to medium-sized dog. And they're excellent pack dogs. And their average traits in the population, they're 16 to 27 kilos for those of you who are imperial addicted, 35 to 60 pounds. They've got amazing chests. They can drive through deep snow like a wolf, right, with the slightly sort of shovel-shaped sort of chest. That's why you hook them up on a sled, and they make excellent sled dogs. They can't be much bigger. I mean, if you're reading the text down here, if they were any bigger, oh, come here, you. There we go. They'd sink deeper into the snow. So there's an optimal body type that's best for survival. Otherwise, it's not really in the survivable interests of the dog. So through a process of selection, it's stabilized and come in towards the average. And that is the essence of what I would test you on. Right? Stabilizing selection doesn't favor the extremes. It favors more of an average body type. This one is one that I really think of when I think of speciation. It's called disruptive selection. And disruptive selection is when you sort of have a common population, but something digs into it. It gets rid of the average. And what we start to see are the extremes of the population taking hold and becoming, well, to subpopulations. And as those subpopulations move off, you start to get speciation. Now, the example being given here is one where they're talking about beak size, thin little beaks versus large beaks. Little tiny beaks are really good for reaching into trees, for example, and hunting insects. And the really, really large beaks, if we look at some of the islands where we've seen disruptive selection, it might be that one population decided to go right after the insects, and the other population decided, heck with it, I'm going for fruit, I'm going for nuts, and I do a better job of surviving that way. Right? Disruptive. This is not a bad example. However, this has happened, for example, in the banded snail, where we had a real mixed population. In the mixed population, We had some brown ones, and we had some yellow ones, and some right in between. And over time, the banding pattern in the snails seemed to start to separate out. What emerged was a brown population and a yellow population, and they really became independent. Interesting. Sort of the yellow and the brown population become two separate subpopulations and eventually speciate. Remember this, the basis of speciation is when you're not breeding with members of what should be your species. And if you're not breeding and there's not a common exchange of genes, you're not going to get a mixture anymore. And if there's not a mixture anymore, you may not even be able to breed after a while. This is my favorite example. I said it would come up. The three-spined stickleback is an ocean-faring fish. I used to catch it off the end of docks. And limnetic means cruising around on the top. Okay, top of the water column. And benthic means that the fish is more or less a bit of a bottom dweller. Hangs out down here. Now, in the case of the three-spined stickleback, there used to be sort of an ancestral sort of common form. And by that, what I mean is, well, where's the version that swam around kind of in the middle? This happy little version here. Where did he go? Or she go? Right, with the big fangs and the fins. And yeah, I know, it doesn't look like this, but it's kind of fun. Right? Where's the intermediate form, which was breeding with the ones on the top and the ones on the bottom, kind of keeping things in the mix? Well, it's gone. And what we got was a limnetic population and a benthic population, and they look substantially different. In fact, they look so different they don't even really interact anymore, much less mate. They probably just eat each other. Here you go. So the benthic one is this one here up on top. Ooh, mondo fish. Look at the size of this thing. And the limnetic is the smaller one. Now, when you look at these two fish and you say, why in the world would this fish, after a while, its body design has changed, it's a much larger fish, is this one really going to interact with this one? Really? No. These populations have become so separate that it's not just body size, but it can be behavioral changes where these populations aren't even breeding. And if they're not breeding, then there's no exchange of genetic material, and what you begin to see is that the benthic ones form a population, whereas the limnetic ones form another population with sort of different body averages. Really, really different. And that's more or less kind of the idea. And the three-spined stickleback is undergoing, many changes. You can see it in the body types right here. Then there's something called genetic drift. I said this is a whopper of a lecture, and I meant it. Genetic drift. It's an interesting term. Like, what's drifting? What do you mean by genetics? Well, genetic drift is when there's a totally random change in the frequency of alleles. It doesn't appear to be something that can be explained by evolution. Like, look at those critters. They're so well adapted, and man, they're all dying off. What the heck's up with that? What's up with that? Well, imagine, and this is sort of a stock example. Imagine a small section of the population says, well, we're out of here. We're taking our genes with us. Now, this can happen with insects, and that's the example you're going to see, where they leave and they take their alleles with them. But it's not like they represented the whole population, right? Imagine a couple disgruntled kids left the school and they say they represent the whole population. I don't think so. They represent a small section of the population. So if they represent a tiny chunk of genes, have they got the population's proportions? The proportions that we are expecting to see? Let's say with blue eyes and brown eyes, 75% brown eyes and 25% of blue eyes. Well, what if all the blue-eyed ones just took off and decided they were going to form a group? Well, blue eyes would come up more often, wouldn't it? Here's the insect example that I was referring to. let's say that these insects here find a food source and they decide they're taking off and forming their own sort of subcolony. They certainly don't represent all of the colors and all of the diversity of the major population. So they take their genes, and as they begin to reproduce, they're like a small subset. So statistically, they're not like the parental generation. And you get these different allele frequencies, just like you would if the colorful ones took off. These ones here, these guys took off and formed their own colony. Well, you would see much more coloration. I'll move this over. They would be a more sort of, the coloration would be more what we call prevalent. And this doesn't make sense because where's the brown ones? Whereas above, well, here's the brown and yellow ones. They formed a subpopulation. Where the heck are the colorful ones? It's not statistically what you would expect. It's a little bit of a kind of an oopsie. Now I'm going to pop out because I got a little sort of tutorial to show you here. So I'm going to sort of turn this off for 1 second. All right, so I'm back out to just sort of my computer proper. And what we've got, this is great. I love this example. Imagine in a population you started with, you had the green bugs and the brown bugs, but through some sort of cosmic accident or, a random step on the bugs, that, well, a couple of these guys got taken out. The initial proportions, although the green were in a minority, you expect to kind of see them showing up more often than this. Now, they're not going to show up in the same proportions you thought. Interesting. Go to history. Had a really good little McGraw-Hill. Here it is. And they talk about genetic drifts here. So I'm going to let this really soothing voice kick in.
Random genetic drift allows allele frequencies to change over time due to chance. The smaller a population is, the more susceptible it is to dramatic changes in allele frequencies due to...
Okay, I got to pause that guy. If you stepped on some frogs here, right, small population, boy, could you ever change the proportion of bright green frogs if you stepped on them. Okay, that could be a really big change.
To genetic drift. In small populations, genetic drift favors a relatively rapid loss of alleles, leading to one allele becoming the only allele remaining for a particular gene. This is called fixation of the allele. Consider a hypothetical situation where a gene has two alleles, capital A and lowercase a. Each allele is present at the start at a frequency of 0.5. We will follow the frequency.
By 0.5, they're saying, hey, let's say this is an allele case where it's 50-50. Okay, what happens due to some chance, unfortunate circumstance?
For the capital A allele. If the starting population is 20 and is sampled from by random mating to produce a new generation of 20 individuals, then dramatic changes in allele frequency are likely. For this sampling, as the process continues for future generations, the capital A allele is quickly lost, meaning that the lowercase a allele becomes fixed in the population.
Okay, so what he's talking about here is a chance extinction of one allelic type. The other allelic type is really all that's left, and it's what's going to take off.
If the simulation is tried again with a new random sampling, dramatic changes in allele frequency will still occur. In this second simulation, the capital A allele becomes fixed in the population, meaning that the lowercase a allele is lost. Other simulations take different paths, but all lead...
Okay, so these are different chances and circumstances. If you want to talk about genetic drift, a really great example is look what happened at the end of the Mesozoic era and the dawning of the Cenozoic era, an asteroid impact that we believe took out a huge genetic complement of our reptilian DNA when the dinosaurs were wiped out. Okay, think about what drifted forward. The alleles and the body types of all that was left. Genetic drift is a chance circumstance that causes a change in the frequency that you would expect. And that's the simplest way to think about it. Okay? Not that you can answer me, but I'll ask you okay anyways. Let's pop back in. Genetic drift is a very important topic. Gotta know it. Read. Moving on from the original population of our genetic drift example. And I think this is redundant at this point. Two populations. When you look at the descendants, these are not the proportions of the greater population. It's a total mix-up from what you would expect. It's due to a chance circumstance, and it changes the way it goes. Now, they talk about this extra term down here called the founder effect. And the founder effect is a way of saying, well, these are the frequencies of the alleles because the founders took a really small chunk of the overall gene pool with them. Right? The diversity is due to genetic drift. You're seeing the founder effect. It's because it was basically a small group that not only migrated, but formed the populations moving forward. They're really just talking about genetic drift. Okay, now if that wasn't enough for you, up comes the Hardy-Weinberg Principle. This doesn't mean, a really tough wine-based principle. Sorry, bad joke. Hardy-Weinberg. It talks about the alleles in a population that you would expect to see. What is the frequency if there's, if critters are mating and the population's large and we're not getting these genetic drifts, what should we expect to see? Well, we've kind of already given it away. You should expect to see that the hybrid traits should come up, say, 75% of the time, and that purebred traits come up about 25% of the time. And that's kind of what begins to happen. I've had students say, well, if blue eyes are recessive, why aren't they just bred out of the population? Well, because now it is a simplification, but it's not terribly irrelevant, because hybrid crosses are common. Hybrids are mutts, okay, and we love our mutts, but when we look at our crosses with our hybrids, and hybrids are inevitable, we still see that 3/4 of the time we see the dominant phenotype, and that 25% of the time we see the recessive. Okay? It's a 3-to-1 ratio. And you can kind of expect this. This should come up in populations with dominant and recessive traits. And if it doesn't, something's probably going on in that population. We call it the Hardy-Weinberg Principle. Okay? This should be sort of a constant thing unless something goes on to change those frequencies. And that's when you dig in as a researcher and you say, okay, what's going on? For a population to reach this sort of genetic equilibrium where we get a very predictable sort of Hardy-Weinberg circumstance, when does a population reach like an equilibrium? Equilibrium is a fancy term which means sort of a steady state. Well, there's 5 ways that a population would reach a steady state. And I love to refer to sharks and crocodiles in this circumstance. If a population reaches sort of a predictable genetic equilibrium, it's because the critters are mating randomly, and we know that doesn't always happen. The population's big, so we're getting a predictable gene shuffle, right? Lots of genes moving around, right? You start to see the averages pop out. Because the population is really large, we don't want to see this founder effect or genetic drift. We don't want a loss where critters are moving into or out of the population. No. All hands on deck, all genes on deck. Because if they are, we'll see the trends. If they're not there, it starts to affect the way it goes. To get to an equilibrium, imagine not a lot of change going on, not a ton. Well, imagine if there were no mutations. Well, if there's no mutations, then a population would become really predictable. You'd be seeing the same kind of genes over and over again. A genetic equilibrium sounds like sort of an evolutionary all-stop or really massive slowing. And that's really what we're talking about, getting to a very predictable sort of genetic sort of ho-hum. And for there to be an equilibrium, there could be no natural selection. That goes with mutations. Okay, so the genes would be the ones we'd expect. They'd be in the population. They'd be cruising around in very predictable ways. Good luck. 5 conditions to achieve genetic equilibrium. These don't happen. But sharks are kind of interesting. If I look at sharks, they've been around a very long time. Yes, sharks are pretty good at random mating. The population, yep, they're pretty big. No movement in or out of the population. Well, except for being caught, sharks are cruising around in the ocean with each other. Yep. But there are some mutations, and there is a bit of natural selection. Sharks, when you look at their body type, holy smokes, it's pretty predictable. There's definitely a genetic equilibrium going on there. In a similar fashion, we talk about alligators. Alligators, random mating, check. Population's pretty big. Hey, they're pretty healthy. If you don't believe it, just go argue with one of them. Movement in or out of the population, well, it's not like alligators are going off and forming clubs. So they keep their genes in the gene pool. So they're an awful lot like sharks. They're subject to natural selection, but how many predators, if you think about it, do sharks and alligators really have? Other than other sharks and other alligators, is there much selection pressure forcing them to change? You know what? I'm going to give this one to both sharks and alligators. And it predicts why they're kind of at a genetic equilibrium, not changing a ton. Although there are those funky sharks called bull sharks that can exist in fresh water. That sounds like a new evolutionary trait to me. Yeah. They're getting a new niche, a new place to cruise around and find food, namely fresh water. So, yeah, even sharks might be undergoing a little bit of selection. We're getting a little bit of variance, but if you look at the shark as a whole, it's pretty perfectly evolved. So, if these 5 conditions are true, which is kind of like chasing pi and finding the last decimal place of pi, 3.14159, I don't know where it ends, thank goodness, then you would be at genetic equilibrium. Well, probably not going to happen. This is almost impossible to achieve. So random mating. Okay. Random mating is when you pick your mate and you don't really have a preference. I don't think this really is going to happen. This poor little guy here, blue-footed booby, he's doing his best to impress his girlfriend, and she's looking at him, and based on behavior, it's like, right? Is it really random? Is this guy putting on a good enough of a show? I don't know. But in populations, mating isn't quite random. It's like going to a club and saying you don't care what anybody looks like, or it's not about blind dating. It never has been, even in the animal kingdom, much less the living kingdom. They talk about sort of a large population. Large populations are like multiple decks of cards. The more cards you have, the less chance you have of losing genes and alleles, and it's like a buffer. It keeps everything in the population. It's good to have large populations. It's called a deep gene pool. Okay? Big gene pool. And it helps to prevent a lot of genetic drift. Big gene pool. Deep gene pool. We've all heard that comment about the shallow end of the gene pool. Large populations make the pool really deep. No movement in or out of the population. What this means is all about keeping the alleles in. And unless there is like a founder effect going on or genetic drift, you're not going to get this. Okay? No movement in or out of the population. Well, It's all about keeping cards in the deck versus not keeping them in the deck. Oh, my dog came over. He's wondering about this stuff. He's also wanting his nightly snack, so I'm going to speed up. Mutations. There could be no mutations. There are always mutations. They're chance genetic events. And some of the mutations are just, they're not good for our survivability. Okay? And we look at this, for example, right? The mutations caused due to copying errors of DNA. Some mutations turn out to not be a tremendous genetic disadvantage, right? This is polydactylism. Count them figures. Oh, come here, marking tool. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And my sister's cat is like this. You'll see it come up in cats. Having an extra finger here, right? That's not a terrible mutation, right? Especially when it comes to grasping things, just having an extra finger. Some mutations don't affect your survival, and some do affect your survival rate. All right, zoom down here. For genetic equilibrium to be reached, there can be no natural selection. Well, that's like saying there's no pressure from the environment on a body type. There's always pressure. There's always competition. And this, no natural selection would be a very rare circumstance. In this case, what they're saying here is no phenotype would have an advantage over another. And that's not going to come up, right? Darwin's finches, of course one phenotype is going to have an advantage over another on a particular island. If you had no natural selection, there'd be no pressure on a population to change. So it would kind of be like an evolutionary equilibrium, bit of an all-stop. Holy smokes, we finally reached the end of this. Okay, so I'll see if I kept this under 55 minutes. Give my dog a snack, because he's been working me over to try to get a dentist stick, or I don't know, one of those jerky treats he likes. This is Mr. B signing off, and remember, you need to read this section, 16.2. So ladies and germs, have a good evening, morning, whenever you're reading this, and we'll talk to you later. Have a good one.